business records exception and certification seems to comply with 902.11. So, Ms. Mull, do you have any objection?
I do have an objection. You can't cross-examine the business record.
Well, the whole point of the exception and 902 is that it would be admissible without extrinsic evidence. Is that not true? Am I misreading the code?
I think you are correct. If the defense wants to call her, we can provide the contact information. They're free to place her on a subpoena if they'd like to call them in their case as well.
All right. I'll go ahead and okay. I'll go ahead and admit the record, and do you want to mark it?
Sure.
And I guess we'll wait till the jury returns to do all of that.
Sure, and we'll be putting our investigator on the stand. And that'll be States 398.
Oh, thank you. Is there anything else before we begin? Have you concluded your review of the pictures?
Yes.
Oh.
And Judge, just for the record, we did agree that the state, I had numbered them, all the autopsy photos. Well, there's States 232, which was initially shown just for identification purposes to one of the EMTs. So I'm having Dr. Darrisaw enter this. So that will be the first autopsy photos. The remainder of the autopsy photos are States 400 through 472. We did agree to remove States 418.
Okay. 400 to 482. And removal of 418.
That's correct.
Okay. Sounds like we're ready. Let's go ahead and have the jurors step in. We're ready to go. State the next witness.
At this time, I'll be reading the stipulation into the record.
All right.
And I've marked it States Exhibit 397 for identification purposes. The following stipulations of facts and evidence agreed to by the state and defense. On November 23rd of 2015, the Georgia Bureau of Investigation received the following evidence. A sealed package containing 4 tubes of abdominal blood, 1 tube of central heart blood, 1 tube of bile, and 1 jar of gastric contents. All tubes were identified as collected from Layla Daniel. Forensic toxicologists from the GBI analyzed the evidence and made the following conclusions. The evidence did not indicate the presence of ethyl alcohol. The evidence did not indicate the presence of barbiturates, certain benzodiazepines, common opioids, ibuprofen, amphetamines, cocaine, or cocaine metabolites. Additionally, the comprehensive drug screen was negative. Number 2. On February 7, 2018, the Georgia Bureau of Investigation received the following evidence. A sealed package containing a towel. On February 8, 2018, the Georgia Bureau of Investigation received the following evidence via forensic biologist Melissa West. 2 cuttings from the towel. Melissa West, forensic biologist, analyzed the cuttings and made the following conclusion. Chemical examination of the stains on the towel did indicate the presence of blood. Number 3. On November 23, 2015, the Georgia Bureau of Investigation received the following evidence. A sealed package containing a bloodstain card labeled Layla Daniel. On March 22, 2017, the Georgia Bureau of Investigation received the following evidence. A sealed package containing buccal swabs identified as collected from Joseph Rosenbaum. On May 25, 2017, the Georgia Bureau of Investigation received the following evidence. A sealed package containing buccal swabs identified as collected from Jennifer Rosenbaum. Ashley Hinkle, forensic biologist, analyzed the cuttings from the towel and made the following conclusion. The cuttings from the towel contained the profile of one individual, that of Layla Daniel. Number 4, on November 24, 2015, the Georgia Bureau of Investigation received the following evidence: a sealed package containing a butter knife collected from the kitchen sink. On March 15, 2016, the Georgia Bureau of Investigation received the following evidence via forensic biologist Melissa West: a swabbing recovered from the blade of the butter knife collected from the kitchen sink, and a swabbing from the handle of the butter knife. Forensic biologists from the GBI analyzed the evidence and made the following conclusions. Chemical examination of the blade of the knife collected from the kitchen sink indicated the presence of amylase, an enzymatic constituent of saliva. DNA obtained from the swabbings from the blade of the knife contained the DNA profiles of 2 individuals. The primary DNA profile obtained from the swabbing from the blade of the knife matched the profile of Joseph Rosenbaum. The secondary profile obtained from the swabbing from the blade of the knife matched the profile of Layla Daniel. DNA obtained from the swabbings from the handle of the knife contained the DNA profiles of 2 individuals. The primary profile obtained from the swabbings from the handle of the knife matched the profile of Layla Daniel. Due to limited data, no conclusions could be made regarding the donor of the additional DNA alleles obtained from the swabbings from the handle of the knife. Number 5. On November 24, 2015, the Georgia Bureau of Investigation received the following evidence: a sealed package containing swabbings collected from the kitchen floor. Chemical examination of the swabbings failed to reveal the presence of amylase, an enzymatic constituent of saliva. Number 6. On June 21, 2019, the state of Georgia received photographs from the defense. The date and time the photographs were taken are accurately reflected in these photographs' file names, date, and timestamp provided to the state of Georgia on June 21, 2019. The dates on the back and front of the photos reflect the date the photo was taken. These stipulations have been agreed upon by both the state and the defense, signed by Assistant District Attorney Daisha Young and signed by Attorney for the Defense, Ms. Kareem Moe.
The court accepts the stipulation. Stipulation are facts agreed to by the parties. Okay. State will call next witness.
State calls Investigator Tina Fleming. Do you swear or affirm that the testimony you shall give in this matter will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Please state your name and spell it for the record.
My name is Tina Fleming, Tinafleming.
Ms. Fleming, how are you currently employed?
I am the supervising investigator over the Sexual Exploitation and Crimes Against Children Unit at the DeKalb County District Attorney's Office.
Okay, and what are your roles as an investigator?
They are to prepare cases for court. After we receive the cases from the police agencies, we do any follow-up that is necessary as requested by the assistant district attorneys or what we believe is necessary to prepare the case for court.
And are you one of the investigators assisting on State of Georgia versus Jennifer and Joseph Rosenbaum?
Yes, I am.
Did you receive an investigative request regarding some business records on this particular case?
Yes, I did.
And do you recall when you received that request?
The request to obtain the records?
Correct.
I believe it was last Friday.
And
Not the Friday that just passed, but the one previously.
Who is the person who asked you to do that request?
That would be you.
And what specific records were you asked to inquire about?
I was asked to obtain the Banana Republic employment timesheet for the time period of June 28th of 2015 for both Whitney Kimball and the defendant Jennifer Rosenbaum.
And did you only request that date, or was it a wider date range that you requested?
I decided to request their records for June of 2015 through 11/17 of 2015, which is the date of Layla's death.
And was there a specific reason why you said June 28th of 2015?
June 28th was testified to by Whitney Kimball as a date that she and the defendant Jennifer Rosenbaum both worked together at the Locust Grove Banana Republic store from 12:30 till 6 o'clock p.m. is what she testified to.
And where did you send your request to get additional information?
Initially, I sent my requests to, I called the store first, and they referred me to the corporate office, which is in San Francisco, California. And I went back and forth between that location and the store. I was referred back 3 different times last week. And ultimately, I was able to ask the store to get me in touch with the district manager for the Locust Grove store, who in turn was supposed to turn that request over to the Human Resources Regional Director for this area versus the corporate location. And I did ask them to have her call me.
And were you ultimately able to, did you ultimately receive some records from Banana Republic?
Yes, I did.
And when did you receive them?
This weekend.
I want to show you what's been previously marked as States Exhibit 398. Do you recognize States Exhibit 398?
Yes, I do.
And what is that document?
Okay. It is a business certification of records, which I sent to the representative for, it's Banana Republic, but it's under the umbrella of Gap Inc. I sent them a business record certification that they could fill out, and which they did, and they signed and had it notarized. I also received a copy of the schedule for employee Whitney Kimball from June 3rd, and it goes to September 26th of 2015. In addition, I received a timesheet for the defendant Jennifer Rosenbaum, and her schedule goes from June 14th of 2015 through October 9th of 2015. And then there's a screenshot copy of those Excel spreadsheets as well. And the final page is we needed to have an explanation as to the timesheets and the codes that are on the timesheets because we do not work for them. And so she sent me a copy of the explanation of the timesheet codes for both individuals.
And Your Honor, at this time, I move to admit States 398 as a self-authenticating business record.
Any objection? Admit.
We can, I'm going to put 398 up on the screen, okay?
Yes.
First, let's look at, which record are we looking at here? And I'll zoom in since I don't think anyone can read that.
Okay, those are the records for Whitney Kimball. That's her timesheet.
Okay. And I will, we'll zoom in specifically to June 28th. Do you see the records for June 28th for Ms. Kimball?
Yes, I do.
Okay. And I might need to kind of move it over some. What are the records showing regarding Ms. Kimball's work on June 28th of 2015?
She worked 1,500 hours in military time, is 3 p.m., and she concluded her time at 2030 hours, which the easy way as a civilian to figure that out is just to subtract 12 from the first number, so that would put her out at 8:30 p.m. that day, and that she was a cashier.
And so was that different than what the testimony she appeared to provide in court?
Yes, it was.
I also want to now move to the second page of this document. And whose record are we looking at here?
That would be the records of Jennifer Rosenbaum.
Okay. And we're looking specifically at June 27. What does it say regarding, I'm sorry, first of all, is there an entry for June 28th of 2015?
There is no entry for June 28th of 2015.
Is there an entry for June 27th of 2015?
Yes, there is.
Okay, and what does that entry say?
It says that she had 9 hours of UTO.
I'm going to show you the last page of this particular document. And what does UTO stand for according to Banana Republic?
It indicates on that explanation sheet that it refers to unpaid time off.
These were what we're looking at on the screen. These were all the dates that Banana Republic had for Ms. Rosenbaum working during the time period in question.
Yes, the time period that I requested. Yes.
Nothing further.
Is there any cross?
Yes, sir. These records that you obtained, they don't tell you who was scheduled to work on a specific date, do they?
It does not say who was scheduled. Yes,
Did
ma'am.
you try and get the schedules?
I did ask for that.
And you were unable to get the schedules, weren't you?
That I was unable to get the scheduled time correct.
And these records don't tell you if an employee was paid for working on a certain date, do you?
It shows the hours worked and the pay. That's the pay is the hours worked at the end of the spreadsheet.
Actually, it shows the hours worked, but does not show anything about whether the person was paid or not.
It doesn't have a paycheck, no.
So there are no pay stubs.
No, ma'am.
So we don't know whether Jennifer Rosenbaum was paid for that day or not paid for that day, do we?
We do because the day before indicated unpaid time off, which means that she didn't have any paycheck. So if she had paid time off, it would have indicated such for June 28th of 2015.
But we're talking about the day before. I'm talking about June 28th.
It indicates that she did not have unpaid or paid leave on that day.
But what it says is that there was unpaid, that she was on unpaid leave. It does not
The day
mean
before.
The day before.
Yes, ma'am.
And on the 28th, there is nothing.
There's nothing indicated for June
And
28th of 2015.
Since these are not the schedules, these don't necessarily correctly reflect whether or not she was at the store on the 28th of June.
It does. It does reflect that she was not there on that day.
It is a document that is produced by the store, but it does not reflect if she was there in another capacity or she was there helping out Ms. Kimball. It doesn't say anything as to that, does it?
It says she wasn't on the payroll for that day.
That's exactly what it says, that
Yes,
she was
ma'am.
not on the payroll. It says nothing about whether she was scheduled to work that day, whether she did work that day, whether just that she did not get paid for that day.
Correct. Yes, ma'am.
And Whitney testified that she got her information based upon a review of her schedule and Jennifer's schedule, didn't she?
I believe she testified that she went back to find her records as to when she worked.
And she talked about her schedule, not her pay stub, not her timesheets.
I don't recall exactly
You
what
don't
she said. I know she said she reviewed her records.
Thank you.
Nothing further.
All right, thank you, ma'am.
Okay.
State will call its next witness.
The state calls Dr. Lora Darrisaw. You raise your right hand to be sworn. Do you swear or affirm that the testimony you shall give in this matter will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
Yes, sir.
You can have a seat. Please state your true and correct name for the record.
Of course, my name is Dr. Lora, Lora Darrisaw, Darrisaw.
Dr. Darrisaw, where do you currently work?
I currently work at the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, which is the GBI.
Okay. And is there a specific division within the GBI that you work in?
Yes, I work for the Medical Examiner's Office.
And what is your title with GBI?
My current title is Director of Pediatric Forensic Pathology.
And what does it mean to be the Director of Pediatric Forensic Pathology?
That basically means that part of my responsibilities are doing many of the pediatric cases or the deaths that involve children. It also means that I have some administrative duties as it relates to our deaths that involve children. And it means that I am responsible for overseeing our program that involves looking at living victims of injury.
And how long have you been in that specific role?
I've had that particular title since October 2014.
How long have you been with the GBI in total?
In total, I did my fellowship training there from 2001 to 2002, and then I was hired on there following that as an associate medical examiner. That was in 2002. During that time, I held the position of Deputy Chief Medical Examiner starting in July 2009. And then, as I mentioned, in October 2014, I became the Director of the Pediatric Service.
Can you explain to the ladies and gentlemen of the jury what exactly a medical examiner is?
A medical examiner is a doctor that practices forensic pathology. And forensic pathology is the branch of medicine that deals with determining generally how people die when there are instances where there may be legal matters.
And what is the difference between a medical examiner and a coroner?
The primary difference is that a coroner is an elected official and is not a doctor, whereby a medical examiner is a licensed physician.
And pediatric forensic pathology, is that a subspecialty of forensic pathology?
There are actually two separate disciplines of pathology. Forensic pathology is one subspecialty of pathology, and pediatric pathology is another subspecialty of pathology. Pediatric being just dealing with children ages less than 17. And so I have board certification and training in both of those separate areas.
And to get board certification and training, well, let's actually talk a little bit more about your education. Can you
Sure.
tell us about your educational background?
Absolutely. I received my Bachelor of Science degree in Electrical Engineering from Marquette University in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. I then received my medical doctorate degree with honors in research from the Medical College of Wisconsin. Following that, I did 4 years of specialty residency training in pathology at the hospitals of the Medical College of Wisconsin. Following that, I did 2 years of specialty training, which is called a fellowship in pediatric pathology. And I did that at Texas Children's Hospital in Houston, Texas. And that was through the Baylor College of Medicine program. And then following that, I did 1 year of fellowship in forensic pathology at the GBI. And that was through the Medical College of Georgia. During my time working at the GBI, I received a master's degree in public administration from Columbus State University.
Did you also receive a master's in any other disciplines?
No, I did do graduate school work in as a master's program in University of Missouri St. Louis. That was between receiving my bachelor's degree and medical school. But I completed 1.5 years of that 2-year program, and the final semester is when I started medical school.
And what were you studying then?
Molecular biology at University of Missouri St. Louis.
Now, you mentioned that you are board certified. Can you tell us what board certifications you have, all of them?
Yes, I'm board certified in anatomic, clinical, pediatric, and forensic pathology.
Have you ever held any academic positions?
Currently, I have a position as an assistant clinical professor with Augusta University, which is the medical college in Augusta.
Now, as a medical doctor, do you have to undergo continuing education?
Yes, sir.
And do you do that?
Yes, sir, I do.
Have you ever presented in any national or regional trainings in the field of forensic pathology or pediatric forensic pathology?
Yes, I've presented at conferences several times in the state of Georgia, a few times in other states in the country, and 1 time internationally.
Have you ever testified in a court of law?
Yes, I have.
And have you ever been qualified as an expert in the area of pediatric forensic pathology?
Yes, sir, I have.
And you know approximately how many times that is?
How many times I've testified?
How many times you've been qualified as an expert?
207 times I've testified, and I've been qualified as an expert in all of those.
Have those been here in the state of Georgia?
Yes, they've all been in the state of Georgia.
Your Honor, at this time, I would ask the court to declare Dr. Darrisaw as an expert in the field of pediatric forensic pathology.
She's so declared.
Thank you, Judge. Can you explain to the ladies and gentlemen of the jury, at a very basic level, what is an autopsy?
At a very basic level, an autopsy is a medical procedure that is done to determine the cause of a person's death.
And why would an autopsy, what are some of the reasons why an autopsy would be completed?
Well, an autopsy is completed to determine a person's cause of death.
And do you know approximately how many autopsies you have conducted?
To date, I've performed 5,230 autopsies.
And pediatric autopsies, are there any differences in how an autopsy may be conducted for a child?
There are not necessarily any differences because obviously the child has the same body parts and things as an adult, so the autopsy procedure is the same. But of course, children have different diseases that affect them that don't affect adults, so the causes of death would be different. In addition to just the autopsy itself, following the autopsy to be able to make a determination of the cause of death, there are other pieces of information that's needed, such as the medical history of the person, the investigative information in terms of the circumstances of that person's death. So with pediatric cases, there tends to be a lot more involvement in looking at their birth history and all of their medical conditions as opposed to with adults.
Is there anything different about the length of time that a pediatric autopsy may take?
No, the length of time of an autopsy is all dependent upon what the findings actually are. Some of the autopsies that take a long time may be autopsies when there are a lot of injuries that have to be documented. So the length of time is dependent upon the actual findings and the cause of the death.
Now, you mentioned that you've done a lot of autopsies. Do you have any idea as to how many of those autopsies you've conducted have been on pediatric?
Yes, 1,287 have been pediatric autopsies.
Dr. Darrisaw, when the body dies in general, kind of what happens to the bodily processes? As far as things like bruising or the further development of how the body may process things?
Well, when the body dies, obviously the heart stops, all of the body organs stop functioning. So when that happens, there's no more responses of the body to, as we know, the body is very capable of responding to injuries and diseases. It tries to heal itself, but when the body is dead, those processes don't happen anymore.
What about the flow of the blood throughout the body? What happens to the blood when the body dies?
The flow of blood stops, the heart stops. The blood is still in the vessels, so it still sits there and it just settles because it doesn't move anymore. So the blood is still within the pipes, if you will, the vessels of the body, but it's not moving as it would be when someone is alive.
Okay. And how about the organs? What happens to the organs themselves when the body dies?
The organs stop functioning.
Now, what about bruises? Can someone who is deceased, can they bruise?
No, they cannot, not in the sense of a bruise. When we talk about a bruise, we are talking about something that happens to a live person. In a dead person, of course, as I mentioned, blood is still in the vessels. So if something disrupts those vessels, that blood will come out. And we consider that pseudo-bruising, that it may look like a bruise. So you can have some discolorations in a dead person from disruption of vessels, but since the blood is not pumping, we don't call those bruises. There may be effects of a pseudo-bruise, and most pathologists are able to decipher real bruises that occur when a person is alive versus blood that comes out of a vessel just because it's in the vessel.
In a living person, how do bruises form, or why do bruises form?
Bruises form when there are impacts enough to break and disrupt a vessel, and that's what a bruise is. A bruise is blood that is outside the vessel and then shows itself underneath the skin surface. So, I mean, we all, of course, are accustomed to bruises. We hit our hand or hit some part of our body on something, and then it bruises. Because what has happened, we have injured a blood vessel, and the blood has come out of that vessel and has shown itself underneath the skin. And that's what a bruise is. It's a blunt impact injury.
Now, if someone, I guess, is in medical distress, that perhaps their heart is not pumping and their blood pressure is dropping, would that affect the body's ability to bruise?
Yes, absolutely. So the way a bruise looks in terms of its size and how extensive it is has to do with a couple of factors. One of the factors is how significant the force is. Of course, if we have a light impact, it's going to be a smaller bruise. A very significant impact is going to be a larger bruise. Another factor is where it is on the body. Some body surfaces, the bruise will be larger, things such as over a bony surface, over your eyebrow versus a thigh or a butt bruise. You have to have a lot more impact on parts of the body that have a lot more fat or muscle. And then the other aspect is how vigorously the heart is beating. And so how much blood is going through the vessel and how fast that is. So when your heart is beating very, very faintly, particularly when you're dying, then impacts to a body surface won't cause very large bruises or things that you see very significantly.
How about whether or not a bruise can continue to heal after death? Is that possible for a bruise to continue to heal or develop after death?
Well, sir, as we talked about, the death process means that the body has stopped functioning.
Now, before you conduct an autopsy, what type of information do you typically have?
The type of information that we have is the information about the circumstances of that person's death. At the GBI, we rely upon information coming from coroners in the counties that we have jurisdiction over. So the coroners provide information in terms of the circumstances of the death. For instance, this was a 90-year-old lady that was in her bed. The previous night she ate and her husband said she was fine. So these are the type of things, information we get. What happened? What were the circumstances? This was a person that was in a motor vehicle accident. That's what we get. And then the autopsy, the actual extent of the autopsy depends upon the information provided. So with an autopsy, sometimes we do just an external examination and draw blood for toxicology analysis. Sometimes we do what's considered a partial examination that documents injuries, for instance, in maybe a motor vehicle accident. And then oftentimes we'll do a full autopsy.
And did you do an autopsy of Layla Daniel?
Yes, I did a complete autopsy on Layla Daniel.
And do you, why, let me ask you this, is there a certain statute that requires autopsies in the state of Georgia of young children?
Yes. There's statutes for certain types of autopsies in the state of Georgia that would be cases where people have sustained violent trauma from another person, such as in gunshot wounds or stab wounds. We do autopsies in cases where a person has died suddenly and unexpectedly, where the cause of death would not be established by any other physician present at the time. Children under 17, there are certain statutes that require an autopsy in many instances, but not all.
Do you recall the date that Layla Daniel died?
I believe that date was November 17, 2015.
And do you recall the date that you conducted the autopsy?
I performed the autopsy on November 20th, 2015.
And is that a standard amount of time to conduct an autopsy?
That's a little bit longer than usual, but it's within the standard time. Normally the autopsy will be done the next day or maybe within 2 days, but within 3 days is not an unusual amount of time, and that has been done on several occasions at our office.
Okay, and is there anything about that delay that would affect the results of the autopsy?
No, sir.
Now, who was present, if you recall, at Layla Daniel's autopsy?
At our medical examiner's office, there's going to be a lot of people present just in the autopsy suite, if you will. There are 8 different stations, and other doctors are working on other cases. Along with the doctors there are the assistants that are performing the autopsies. But outside of just our staff that were in the autopsy suite, not necessarily focused on Layla's case as I was, there were law enforcement individuals as well as some individuals from DFACS, or the Department of Family and Children Services, as well as the coroner of the county attended Layla's specific autopsy.
If a body is preserved, how similar is the body to as it was when the person died versus when they get to you?
Well, we don't expect any differences. When the body has died and it's in a cooler, which it would have been at I believe she arrived to our office on the 18th, which was the day after she died. Prior to that, presumably she was at the hospital cooler. And so there's no changes otherwise in the body that would alter the autopsy done on that day versus on the 17th when she died.
And do you do anything to memorialize the autopsy itself?
During the course of the autopsy, photographs are taken to document any findings, and an autopsy report is finalized.
And Dr. Darrisaw, I'm going to show you what's been previously marked as states 232, along with states 400 through 472. With one exception, there's no states 418, okay?
Sure.
Do you recognize these particular photographs?
Yes, sir, I do.
And how do you recognize these photographs?
These are photographs that were taken under my direction at the time of autopsy that I did on Layla. And within each of the photographs, there's a placard that has the unique identifying number that was assigned to this particular case at our office.
And do these documents, or do these photographs fairly accurately represent the autopsy that was conducted on November 20th of 2015 of Layla Daniel?
Yes.
Your Honor, at this time I move to admit states 232 along with states 400 through 472 minus 418.
Admitted.
Now, before we start going through the photographs, Doctor, I want to, you made a couple of findings or notations in your record. You said that rigor, you made a notation of rigor that it was fixed. What does that mean?
Rigor mortis is or rigor, some people say rigor, I say rigor. That is the process of the muscles of the body becoming stiff after death. And so I made note that Layla's body was still stiff at the time of autopsy. But then, of course, she had been refrigerated as well.
And were there any decompositional changes to Layla during the examination?
There was not.
And what are you talking about when you talk about decompositional changes?
What we're talking about with decompositional changes is that after the body dies, bacteria starts to accumulate in the body. And over time, you start with green discoloration, then the body may become bloated, all the way to the point where there's skeletonization. But in this case, the body was still preserved. There had been no prolonged exposure to outside elements that would cause the body to start to become decomposed.
When you begin your examination, what is the first thing that you do when you begin an examination?
Well, generally the first thing that's done is the body is received at our office in a body bag with labels on the back that have the identification of the person. We take photographs of the outer part of the bag to show the name, and then the bag is open and photographs are taken of just how the body is received before anything is done.
I'm showing you States Exhibit 400. Is this how Layla's body was received when you first began the autopsy?
Yes, sir, it is.
And all of these things that we see on here, what are those? What are all of these things that we see on her?
So what we're seeing on her is the medical therapeutic devices that were placed on her with the resuscitation efforts by EMTs in this case. So this is how she was received. This is the photograph taken just after the body bag is open. And all of the medical therapeutic devices are still on the body, and that's recommended, and that should be the case so that we are able to see what's on the body, and if there is any changes to the body that may have occurred from those, we're able to note that.
As a result of your autopsy, was any of the medical intervention that was done, did that have any impact on her cause of death?
No, sir.
States 401. What is this photograph?
This is a photograph of Layla's body after all the medical therapeutic devices are removed. This shows the front of her body, an overall photograph.
And states 402.
And this is an overall photograph of the back of the body after all the medical therapeutic devices are removed.
The photograph, did you ultimately shave her head?
Yes, in this particular autopsy, during the course of the external examination, I identified several injuries to her head. Like normally, if there are injuries to a person's head, such as a gunshot wound or bruise, we will shave the area just around the injury to facilitate documenting that with photographs. When numerous injuries are found, such as in this case, it necessitated me shaving the entire head. But this would not be the normal case in an autopsy, but in this particular case, I did shave all of the hair on the head because several injuries were identified.
I'll show you which one admitted at states 232. What are we looking at states 232?
This is a photograph of the face. This is one of our typical photographs that we take in all cases, is to take a facial identification photograph. But in this photograph, there are some injuries that we see already.
Okay. Dr. Darrisaw, I left an electronic pointer up there for you, if you want to use that, and I have one too. You mentioned some injuries. What do you see when you look at states 232 as far as injuries that you can observe?
I'm looking at this photograph starting from the top where the hairline would have been. There's an abrasion or scrape of the skin on the right side of the forehead. We see a couple of abrasions on the end of the nose. Let's go back up here. There's a bruise on the left side of the front of the scalp. There's a red mark, looks like an abrasion on the lower lip.
Well, let me ask you this before we go any further. You mentioned having a history. What information, if any, did you have at the time of autopsy regarding what had happened to Layla Daniel?
As it relates to the circumstances that we were provided concerning Layla's death, information was that she was home with her, I believe it was a foster mother, as well as an older sibling. There was information that she appeared to be choking during an eating event. After that, the foster mother provided resuscitation intervention. The Heimlich maneuver was provided as what happened, and then some other aggressive CPR, at which point in time later 911 was called. 911 got to the house, continued CPR. She was transported to the hospital, but was pronounced dead essentially upon arrival.
Since the autopsy, have you also reviewed any other information regarding the history or an account of what happened inside that home?
Yes, I have reviewed 911 audio recordings. I've reviewed transcripts and the video recordings of interviews with the foster mother, giving her statements of what happened on that particular day. I've also reviewed medical records of the child from the terminal hospitalization. I've reviewed forensic interviews and an interview with law enforcement that was done with Layla's sibling.
Just as an overview, and then we'll kind of unpack this and go through all the individual injuries. Did you have, as a result of this autopsy, did you come to any results as to any significant findings that led to the death of Layla Daniel?
Yes, I did.
And what were your findings, your significant findings in this case?
The very significant findings was that on the external surface, and you saw those in the overall photographs, was that Layla had numerous bruises on many parts of her body, ranging from and extending from her head all the way down to her legs. The most prominent bruises were on her back, and that involved generally, or actually the entirety of the back for the most part, extending from the neck all the way down to the butt area. In addition to all of the external injuries, there were very significant internal injuries that involved the abdomen. The organs inside her abdomen were injured, and those were the liver, the pancreas, the supporting tissues of the small and large intestine, which are called the mesentery. Those were injured. Because of those injuries, there was internal bleeding. And in addition to that, she had a lot of bruises on her head that were identified not only on the external surface, but when I reflected the scalp.
So when you say you reflected the scalp, what do you mean?
When I say reflect the scalp, part of the autopsy examination is to look at the brain, and the way one is able to take the brain out is to make a cut across the scalp from one ear to the other and then reflect it. It's kind of like pulling back the covers on your bed. And, you know, when the covers are on your bed, you'll see the external surface, but when you pull them back, you'll see what's under there. And sometimes what you find underneath is different from what you see on the outside. So we're able to do that with the scalp. That also allows me to look at the skull to see if there's any fractures. Then the skull is removed and the brain is taken out.
You mentioned something about being able to see things inside. Is it possible for there to be signs of trauma internally that are not seen on the outside of the body?
That's correct, and that is why an autopsy is performed, because there's a lot of things you can have happening on the inside, particularly as it relates to trauma, that is not evident from the outside.
Now, regarding an airway obstruction, how would a child typically respond if their airway was fully blocked? Like, what kind of external signs would you expect to see of the child while they were living if their airway was blocked?
Well, the first thing that happens when your airway is blocked, whether you're a child or an adult, and I think this is something that everyone is familiar with, is you reflexively start to cough. Something goes down your airway instead of your esophagus where it should go, and you start to cough. That's a reflexive thing that you're trying to free the obstruction on your own. Over time, you then may have these spasms of coughing where you're trying to cough it up. That progresses to difficulty breathing, maybe not being able to speak because your airway is blocked.
With what you observed from Ms. Rosenbaum's interview with police, did what she described appear to be the signs of a child choking?
What I observed in what she described, I would say would not be what I expect or commonly see when someone has an event where their airway is blocked by a foreign object. The ideal of choking may be a word that is confused with actually airway obstruction by a foreign body. So what I observed is a description of the child having choking was the word used, but in the description she describes that the child's head kind of moved back, her arms were moving, her legs were moving, and her whole body was kind of moving such that it was a little bit distracting to her. And that's a description of actually a seizure. I mean, we know that when we're talking about arms moving, legs moving, the whole body shaking, the word seizure was not used by her, but that's a description of a seizure. So this appeared to me to be a child that was having a seizure that was then, you know, with her head moving back. At one point in time, there is a description of her eyes rolling back in her head. And again, these are all features of a seizure and not of a foreign body obstruction of the airway, coughing and trying to free a foreign body in the airway.
Now, when I hear seizure, I think of something like epilepsy. Is that the only thing that can cause a seizure or seizure-like activity?
Well, epilepsy is an actual natural disease process where one has seizures on a regular basis through life. But also at the time of death, depending on what the circumstances are, you have terminal seizures. Terminal seizures are quite frequent with head trauma. They're quite frequent with various types of trauma where you have blood loss. And so as you have blood loss, your body is starting to go into shock because blood is not flowing in the vessels, supplying oxygen to all your organs. But your body is going to shock. You're losing blood. And those are the type of things that cause these seizures as one is dying. And so the whole scenario and events that I have reviewed are a description of a child that is going into shock as opposed to as a child that has a foreign object such as food. In this particular case, the suggestion was that she had choked on chicken. The description is not consistent with that at all.
Is the description that she gave consistent with the internal injuries that you observed at autopsy?
Yes, absolutely. So what I observed and what I've previously testified to is that the autopsy, at the time of autopsy, I identified significant blunt impact trauma to the abdomen. There was a liver laceration. There was a laceration of the pancreas. The laceration of the pancreas actually separated it into two pieces. And there was internal bleeding. And so, given those findings that I found at autopsy, the description of everything that was happening is quite consistent with the fact that she had this trauma, and then these are the symptoms of the trauma. She's starting to have a seizure, her head is falling back, her eyes are rolling back, she's not breathing very well, and then this could be considered, choking type thing because she's gagging, she's not breathing, she's having seizures. These are all things that are expected and commonly seen with people that have trauma and are losing blood and are going into shock, and then, as in this particular case, she eventually died.
Now, how quickly after the traumatic injury could someone start to show signs of what you described?
Well, the signs of what I would describe with abdominal trauma, particularly if you don't have very significant head trauma along with it, the abdominal trauma is not going to cause an instantaneous or immediate death. And then, of course, it depends on how extensive the trauma is. When there are very extensive traumatic injuries to an organ that is has a lot of blood vessels, the time of death will be quicker. I can say in Layla's autopsy, based upon everything that I did with the autopsy, including the external examination, the internal examination, I took samples of the injured organs. I looked at them under the microscope. It's most consistent with the trauma having occurred about an hour, give or take some time or so, a few minutes, not an hour to 4 hours, but around an hour before she actually exhibited the symptoms that were described.
And the symptoms that she described could have been the outward manifestation of the trauma that was previously inflicted. Is that correct?
That's exactly what appears to have happened, that she had a traumatic event about an hour or so before she was at the table and exhibited these symptoms.
Now that hour frame could also be a little bit shorter, correct?
Yes.
Now, if something was obstructing the airway and it had not been expelled, would you expect to find that foreign object when you conducted the autopsy?
Absolutely.
And when you conducted the autopsy, did you find any chicken?
No. And when I conducted the autopsy, I didn't find any food particles in the trachea. So the trachea it's a tubular structure. It's where the air goes into the lungs. And so it's a tube, and then it branches into two major branches as it goes into the right and left lungs. I did not find any food particles in either region of the trachea in the top part as it goes down, nor when it branched into the lungs.
How about the stomach? Did you find any evidence of chicken in the stomach?
The gastric contents or the stomach contents that were identified at autopsy was just very well digested material. I was not able to identify any particular identifiable food particle. So it was just digested material that was a certain color, but I didn't find any intact food particles that I would be able to identify as, oh, this is chicken or this is rice.
Now, does the digestion of food continue after death?
No, it does not.
Does would you have expected if she was eating something as stated that you may find something in her stomach?
Normally, if one eats very shortly before death, we will be able to identify the food itself because it hasn't been digested yet.
I want to go through some of the photographs. I'm going to show you State's Exhibit 404. What are we looking at in State's 404 that was significant to you at the autopsy?
So this is, again, the scalp after the hair has been shaved. This would be the face here. It's the back. You see her left ear. On the back of the scalp, there's a large bruise. This is this red-colored bruise on the back. There are several scratches or abrasions. An abrasion is a scratch. When you skin your knee, things like that, that's an abrasion, or scratches. So we have all of these scratches and abrasions linear on the scalp. There's some back here, on the back of the scalp, on the top, on this left side. There's another abrasion here. More towards the top and the front, you can see a hint on the surface of bruising. This becomes much more evident when I reflect the scalp, as I previously talked about. Sometimes, and obviously we see things a lot better as pathologists because we can look on the inside of the body. But we can see the bruising here. We'll see it a lot better when I reflect the scalp. So there's a lot of injuries on her head, bruises and abrasions.
Now, to be fair, you stated that you observed an extensive amount of bruising over her entire body, correct?
Yes.
Could some of the bruises that you observed have come from child's play or accident?
Some of the bruises were in areas where it's expected to find bruises in a child of this age. So in a child of this age, there are locations where we expect to find bruises. We expect to have bruises in a child, maybe on their forehead, the back surfaces of their arms or front surfaces of their legs, because children run, they fall, their knees get skinned, they have bruises on their knees, the front parts of their body. So yes, I found things of that nature, but there are other locations where you never typically see children getting bruised in regular activities that a 2-year-old would do. So she had bruises over areas of her pubic area. She had very extensive bruises on the entirety of the back. Those are not locations that we expect and commonly encounter when children of this age just have activities of normal living.
Now, when we're looking at States 404 at the kind of the top of her head, are any of these injuries typically consistent with, say, accident?
Well, in isolation, if one looks at one of these injuries in isolation, any one of them could be a bruise that maybe a child gets. In isolation, a bruise on the back of her head certainly can happen. If a child falls and hits the back of their head, of course you'll have a bruise there. In isolation, could you have a scratch on the top of your head? Yes, absolutely.
Now,
but with all of these on her head, it's quite concerning that these would be from a simple event that a 2-year-old would encounter.
Now, did you count up the number of injuries that you observed on Layla's head and neck?
Yes, I did.
And how many injuries did Layla have just on her head and neck?
So what I do in my autopsy, especially when there are a lot of injuries, and this may be blunt force injuries or gunshot wounds or stab wounds, I'll categorize everything into locations, and then I'll describe them by numbering them. And the numbers don't mean this is how they occurred, or it doesn't mean that one is more severe than the other. But in this particular case, I listed 22 injuries involving the head and neck area.
Go through some of these photographs, okay? Showing you stage 405. What are we looking at in stage 405 that you found significant when you conducted the autopsy?
This is the left side of the face and head. So we saw this in the other picture, but we can see more its location. This is an abrasion. We can see an injury on her ear, over the surface of her ear, which is another type of area that was considered quite concerning, that ear injuries are not injuries that, ears are not typically injured in accidental manners in children. So this is a location of an injury here that's quite concerning. Again, we see, bruises. They're kind of faint yellow-brown here. We'll see how that looks on the inside more than on the outside. So that's the left side of her face.
Now, you mentioned the colors of bruising. Can you tell us a little, are you able to accurately date a bruise simply based upon the color?
It's pretty simple for probably anyone in this courtroom to be able to differentiate a bruise that's fresh versus old just by looking at it. Because we all are very familiar with bruising has a very well-recognized process of first being kind of a reddish color, and over time it becomes brownish yellow, and everyone is kind of familiar with, oh, yeah, I bruised my arm a week ago, that's why it looks like that, or I just bruised it, it's red. But in terms of being able to talk about whether a bruise is an hour old or 1 day, it's not a precise science, but the pathologist has a couple of other options outside of just being able to look at the bruise just on the outside. I'm able to make a cut into the skin and look at the skin, what it looks like underneath the bruise. I'm able to take a sample of the bruise and look at it under the microscope. So that allows me to get some better degree of accuracy and at least giving an estimation of how old a bruise may be. Certainly it's not a specific time, that occurred 4 hours ago, but generally given a range of, oh yeah, that's a bruise that probably happened in that day or maybe 2 days ago. So a pathologist is able to do that, and I would say that all of us in this courtroom are able to say that looks old, that looks fresh, and be quite accurate in that judgment.
Now, I think we'll look at stage 406. Is this another view of something we've looked at?
Yes, sir, it is.
Now, I want to show you stage 407, which is a close-up of the left ear. Now, you mentioned that this is concerning, and what could this type of injury be consistent with?
I described this, I just made a description of this. I talked about the fact that it's a red injury with skin loss. So you can see how you can have the skin loss is here. It is dry. There is some drying artifact to it because this is a dead person. This could be an abrasion, or another option may be a burn even. It doesn't particularly look like a thermal injury, but it certainly could be a burn. If one is accustomed to having burns on the ear, maybe from hair products, they can look like this. But it's an injury on the ear. It's a very odd location for a 2-year-old to have this injury. If it's an abrasion, the type of events that may happen would be pulling on the ear very vigorously and strongly. Those can cause abrasions on the ear, pinching the ear hard.
I'm going to show you stage 409, which is the back of that same ear.
Mr. Chase?
Yes.
Sure. This moment.